I think the workshop has been extremely effective so far. It's always a useful thing to bring together experienced practitioners, such as we have here with the provincial prosecutors, that are able not only to share ideas and contrast their practice with current international practices, but perhaps more importantly to share ideas amongst themselves, because they don't have many opportunities to come together to share their experiences. So I think from the perspective of the workshop, one of the most valuable things is to listen to your practitioners, to some of the local practices they've developed to meet the complexities of this challenge, some of which are really top class. So I think it's, so far as I can see, it's a very, very useful exercise. I think, notwithstanding that you have a different system from many other parts of the world, I don't think the roles change. For me, the judiciary issue is they remain above the investigation and prosecution, and their role is to adjudicate based on the strength of the evidence and the compliance with the law to ensure a fair trial. But the key issue is, I think that should be considered as a matter of urgency in Argentina, is the police are being specialised to combat this extraordinarily complex crime. The prosecutors have taken the same steps. So for me, I think one of the key issues is to ensure that the judiciary have a sufficient awareness of the complexity of the crime, the impact on the victims, and the challenges that you are struggling with, and we're all struggling with, in trying to find criminal justice solutions to trafficking. For the prosecutors, I actually, coming from an adversarial Anglo-Saxon system, actually much like your system, where the prosecutor is involved in the investigative process at a much earlier stage. And for me, the key role of the prosecutors, as you practice, is to direct, firstly oversee and evaluate what evidence the police may or may not have acquired, and then direct the investigation as the case is built. So I think, and the examples from around the world prove the same point. Wherever you see, such as your model, where the evidence collector, the police, are working under the early direction and supervision of the evidence presenter, the prosecutor, the outcomes within the courtroom are markedly better. Within the regional context and the national context, Argentina, I think, is becoming more and more of a target for global traffickers. It's important to realize that this crime is now a classic example of globalization. And from my knowledge of working with Argentine colleagues, your situation here is transforming from internal trafficking from Paraguay, from Bolivia. Now you have Chinese, and I think the future means that this crime will get worse in Argentina. But that's not unique to Argentina. That's the situation in many, many countries. In terms of the response, I think that the situation in Argentina is also in parallel with many of your neighbours. The structures have been put in place. The 208 law is there and is being strengthened. The issue now, I think, is to actually refine the practice. So I think in terms of the response, Argentina is making very significant strides, and it's really now, I think, about coordination and practice. I think from the exposure I've had and the pleasure I've had of working with yourselves during this visit, I would identify these three issues. The first one would be specialisation. There are specialist units now within the police, and we now have a specialist office within the federal prosecution structure. And I think it would be important for practitioners, Argentine practitioners in the prosecution service, to look back at the current structure and see if the specialisation is adequate to meet the complexity and the threat posed by the challenge of the traffickers. The current global trend, very clear trend, which doesn't mean it's correct for Argentina, it's for Argentines to assess, is specialise the police and specialise the prosecutors and put them together. So I think the first issue would be specialisation. I think the second issue is, in terms of the practical challenges, is in the context of securing the conviction of traffickers based on the oral testimony of victims as witnesses, you face a huge obstacle in terms of the time it takes from initial declaration to oral testimony. And the lessons from around the world show unequivocally, the longer that period is, the less likely it will ever be that that witness will be available on the day you require. So I think, again, practitioners need to step back with those that draft the legislation and the procedures to see how that may be ameliorated, either by fast-tracking, by strengthening the anticipated depositions. But while it remains, it may be 2, 3, 4 years, it means, in effect, without over-exaggerating it, you are trying to meet your responsibilities with your hands tied behind your back. In terms of the third issue, I think then, from what I see, the word that screams out to me, based on my experiences, is the word coordination. Because as we've seen with this workshop, there are practices that have been developed by your colleagues in their workplaces that are absolutely top class, that reflect some of the best practices that are seen around the world and that other parts of the world could learn from. And they've been sharing these ideas. And for me, it's almost a sense of frustration that, if you will, everything is in place, but it won't reach its potential unless it's coordinated. So that relates to the coordination between the police and the prosecutors at the earlier stage, the coordination between the police, the prosecutors, and the Office for Rescue and Support. It's as though all the pieces are in place. The key issue now is to actually draw the three things together. It's just really to reiterate that I think your country has taken very, very significant strides, and it's very encouraging to see that there's no sense of complacency here. Nobody that I've had the opportunity and privilege of talking to is presenting the position of, we've got this repaired, we're on speed with this. I think the key issue now is simply, as I said in the earlier response, is there needs to be a coming together of all the key players within law enforcement, prosecution, and the victim support element of this complex problem. And then one has got to step forward and take the lead, and be mandated to take the lead to say, okay, we need to coordinate this whole response. We've got some high-class stuff we're doing, but it needs to be developed and promulgated. Somebody needs to coordinate and take responsibility for leading it at the ground level.